I don't know where Naomi went. She was here first service. Oh, there you are. Give Naomi, yeah, no, you guys can applaud, yeah. I know it's so fun seeing yourself on screen. You guys sounded like you liked seeing yourselves on screen, which is kind of funny. Or maybe you were just surprised. I don't know. Either way. Hey, I'm curious, before we jump into this week's passage, everybody got really quiet. What was that? You guys okay? Can I ask a really embarrassing question? Like, no. I have the mic, so I'm going to. But it's okay. It's a safe place. No judgment. I wanted to ask about a specific sin, like if anybody in the room has committed it. You think Ed's hand went up. Okay. Safe place. Has anybody ever worried before? You have. Only all of us, right? Anxiety, worry is just such a thing that we live with, and it hits at the weirdest times. I find myself, now that I'm getting older, I guess, like, I don't know if that's the motivator, but it feels like things hit me different than they used to. And it seems like I should be getting better at this anxiety thing. I should be getting better at the worry thing. And it actually might be working in reverse. I was in Central Florida a few weeks ago. My girls were at a dance competition, and my wife didn't want me to have to sit through the whole thing, which God bless my wife. And so she was like, I'll call you when we get a few acts before the girls. I'm like, awesome. So I'm at the hotel, and she calls, and I head over, and I make it just in time for the act before my girls' act. And it was girls that just a little bit older than mine. Mine are going into 4th and 2nd grades. I think it's something like that. There's so many of them, and it changes all the time. The ones that I saw must have been probably around 5th grade, I suppose, and they lined up on stage and doing this routine to Tina Turner's song, What's Love Got to Do with It? It's an old song. Nothing new about this song. It's catchy. And I don't know if it's the fact I'm 43. I don't know if it's the fact that I have girls. But I'm listening to the lyrics of this song. And like these tears well up in me as I'm going, no. What's the message behind that song? Like, and I'm not like one of those people who's out there railing against culture. This is a 30-year-old song, maybe 40 years old. But I was just like, as someone who has daughters, I'm like wanting to protect them from the lyrics of this. Go, no. Love has a lot to do with it, right? You're beautiful, and like you should have these really high values for yourself, and everything is hitting like that now. Like I'm in that dance competition, and it's welling up inside of me. Like, oh gosh, I remember later that day there was an episode of Seinfeld. Y'all, I never realized how much promiscuity was such a big part of Seinfeld. This is not a new show. This is old. And as someone who's 43 now, I'm kind of off of social media. I check it occasionally, but every now and then you see what's trending, and there's these things that are trending that are teaching our girls, our boys, these really despicable things when it comes to intimacy. It is going viral, and I'm the old man now shouting from the balcony going, no! Remember Stadler and Waldorf? Like, that's me now. And I just feel this anxiety coming over me, and it's like this toothache that I just can't stop tonguing, right? It's just like it hurts. And I don't know if you guys struggle with that too. Like anxiety kind of functions like that. Worry can kind of function like that. It's this open wound that you carry out into the world, and it feels like everything is hitting up against it. And staggering numbers now of Americans are experiencing this more than any other country. Is what I'm learning. We fight anxiety and depression on a daily basis. In 2010, this is 14 years ago. In 2010, there were 253 million prescriptions for antidepressants in the U.S. alone. That was in a nation of 311 million people. So if you just want to round, 253 million prescriptions, 311 million people. That's a high percentage of people who struggle, and that's no judgment. We struggle with worry. We struggle with anxiety. And it's a typically normal human emotion. Wouldn't you agree? Like, in fact, we're kind of biologically hardwired to have anxiety about certain things. It's what's gotten us here. It's a survival thing. There's things that you should be frightened about, necessary for your survival. Our brain has been wired to prioritize this emotion when we feel it. However, it can be abnormal in certain circumstances. When it comes to be an issue that you walk with, it affects your daily ability to function in everyday situation. And 20% of our population has a disorder when it comes to anxiety. That's just not heightened anxiety. That's a disorder when it comes to it. It's so prevalent worldwide, here in America specifically. And to this idea, to this concern, 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Peter writes a letter. You guys know we've been studying his letter this summer as a church. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter's beginning to land the plane. He's got some final last words that he wants to share. He's writing as you turn there. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand. We'll bring you one. You can use your device. But if you want a real paper one that you can take notes in and you can own, we will bring you one right now. Like Jay is back there waiting to give you one. You can put your name in it. Take it home. We think these scriptures, these pages, there's something tactile about having it in front of you, right? In 1 Peter, Peter is writing a letter to second-generation Christians, as you turn there, to second-generation Christians who are about to endure hardship. They're about to endure persecution. Some of them already are. And it's lingering on the horizon, right? In 2 years from writing this letter, Peter himself is going to die under the widespread public persecution of Christians under Nero. And he's finishing his letter here. He's winding things down. And just like you would imagine, if someone is about to get off the phone saying, I got a few last things I got to say, right? He's got to get a few more lines in. He's so passionate towards these believers about what they need to know before he hangs up, what he's got to tell them. As an old man to children, first generation to second generation, he starts addressing those challenges in life and how we're to approach them. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, he says this, all of you, how many of you? I'm so glad. The first service was like, all of you, how many of you? And they were like, oh. It's so early and gray. All of you. How many of you? Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. So I want you to see what Peter is going to do in just a moment. There's a connection, a flow, an argument that he makes. He connects ideas like dominoes. And what he's setting up for, and I want you to see this as we dip into it, humility, we will see in a moment, is demonstrated by submission to God. Humility is demonstrated by submission to God. And the idea of submission is just simply not a popular one. We live in a world that says to advance yourself, to assert yourself, to be assertive, to fight for yourself. And Peter here is writing to say, actually, sometimes it is necessary to submit yourself. And true humility is the ability to cheerfully put away your own agenda for your life for God's. Isn't it true that we all have an idea for how we think our lives will go? An agenda for our lives, a dream, a vision, a way, a pattern that we see it going, a story arc. And we've said throughout this book that Peter is writing to a group of people from the perspective of an old man who kind of knows the pattern of life. Secular science has come around this with the idea of what we call stage theory, that there's certain stages to our lives that are kind of predictable across the board. And what they all agree on is that for a high percentage of us, something hits around midlife. some challenge, some curveball, some disruption, and it changes us, right? And Peter is writing to say that these patterns, these rhythms, these curveballs that hit can be used by God to purge us of ourselves and to purify us more and more into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. And Peter is writing here, like, to continue through that hardship, to continue through that suffering. Humility, Peter is arguing, is a submission to it, an acceptance of it, an acquiescence. Thomas Schreiner writes this: the humility he means here is that people are to accept the suffering God has ordained as his will, rather than insisting and resisting and chafing against his will while suffering. That's hard, isn't it? It's choosing to, okay, God, this seems to be what you have for me. Choosing to accept it rather than buck against it. It leads, Peter would argue, to a type of purging, a type of purification. Guys, this is Jesus in the garden the night before his crucifixion, isn't it? When he brought his heaviness, his broken heart before God, he went into Gethsemane, literally a place that means olive press. Jesus is about to be pressed. He's about to be put through suffering, and he pleads his heart to God. He says, my soul is overwhelmed unto death. He's honest about his feelings. He owns them. I don't want to go through this. I don't want to suffer. He communicates to his God what he's feeling, and then before he hangs up the phone, remember what he says. But not my will, but your will. 3 times. That's what Peter is advocating here. That needs to be our stance. We don't have to enjoy it. We don't have to look forward to it. We do need to get better at it. And he says it's an act of humility, of choosing, you know what, I'm not going to chafe against this anymore. I'm actually going to surrender to it. He says, clothe yourselves with humility. Isn't that beautiful? Clothe yourselves with humility. And it's easy to think of the picture that's probably in his mind of this. He probably reflected, I would argue, to that upper room. You remember from John's gospel? That's what got us to 1 Peter. We studied the Gospel of John on the calendar, landed us at Easter. Then we went back through the upper room discourse, that time Jesus spent pouring into the disciples the night before his crucifixion, there in that upper room. It takes up 1/3 of John's gospel. That's important stuff. And then John's gospel ends in a conversation between Jesus and Peter, which is why we followed Peter into 1 Peter, but there in that upper room, that 1/3 of John's gospel, Jesus says a number of things to the disciples before he goes, before everything changes for them. Some stuff before he hangs up the phone on them. He says, you got to know some stuff. 1, you're going to have a Holy Spirit who's going to empower you, and we talked about that, you remember? And then 2, the type of love that you guys are to have for one another is going to be so different, it's going to change the world. You're going to put each other first. You're going to serve one another. You're going to humble and submit yourselves to one another, right? And the guys are all looking at each other like, this is crazy, because that was unheard of in the first century world. And Jesus sees their confusion, pushes back from the table and says, actually, I see you're going to need a picture for this. And he stands up, and the firstborn of all creation, Colossians chapter 1, the most supreme being in the universe, took a slave's apron, wraps it around his waist, grabs a water jar and a basin, and heads to the scaly, crusted, muddy feet of the disciples and began peeling off those crusted, layered leather shoes. He says, you're going to need a picture for this. It's going to need to be burned in your brains. And boy, was it. Clothe yourselves in humility. That's what Peter says. This is the idea, the picture, the image in his mind is of Jesus pushing back from the table, the most supreme in all the universe, and putting on an apron. He's clothing himself with humility. And this is so astounding, so shocking, that Peter is a bit disgusted by it in John's gospel. You remember? He's the disciple that objects. He says, "Never, Lord," verse 8, "never shall you wash my feet." And think about it. You'd be there too. No way I'm letting you down. You, Jesus, the Son of God, deity, God in flesh, you're going to wash my feet. No, thank you. Like, there's no way I'm letting that happen. And Jesus answers, "Unless I wash you, you will have no part of me." And then Peter, having to one-up himself like Peter always does, he goes, "Oh, well then wash all of me," right? This idea was so offensive to Peter. It's repulsive to him. The idea of Jesus washing his feet, we can all relate to that, right? And it's an act, though, of, well, pride, isn't it? I'm not letting you touch my feet. That's uncomfortable. And Peter's come to understand through his journey, through his life, that choosing to follow Jesus, well, really, there's no place for pride in that. Following Jesus isn't a race to the top, it's a race to the bottom. And part of that is acceptance, not refusal. Allowing God to have his way, not pushing back because of pride. Isn't that why Peter quotes in this next verse the proverb? It says, "God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." And this is what he's kind of setting up for, right? He says, "All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." You're like, that's an odd place for this verse from Proverbs. What he's doing as he writes, though, it seems he's making an argument that pride is the secret sin that lurks behind two things, I would argue, probably a lot more. Two things specifically today: worry and control. Pride is the enigmatic secret sin lying behind those two things. And we don't often think of pride as that. We don't often think of people with anxiety as having a pride issue. But in a moment, Peter's going to connect humility with acceptance and release and peace. He's going to connect humility with that. And if humility manifests itself in us handing over our worries to God, if we choose to worry, then we are choosing not to hand over our worries to God because we don't think he can be trusted with our worries. And that's a pride thing. God, I'd give you this, but I don't think you're capable, so I'm going to hang on to it for a minute. God, I can't trust you with this. That's what we're saying. That's what Peter will say in just a moment. Also, he's going to connect the sin of control with pride, our resistance to God's will. That's what he's laying the foundation for here, putting away our own agendas and receiving his, not chafing beneath or against as we fight or resist, but instead just accepting what God might have for us. It communicates that when we're frustrated by God's plans, we actually think it would be better if we were in charge. I know better than you. And that's a pride thing. And what Peter says when he quotes this proverb is God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that's really important that you circle, underline, highlight that word oppose. He opposes the proud. When I was a kid, I always thought that in this pull yourself up by the bootstrap society, where we seem to really look up to people who have those self-made stories, don't we? We aspire to be that. People who advance themselves and have what it takes and do what it takes, right? Peter seems to be quoting a proverb that says, okay, you want to do it on your own? God's stance is, oh, I'm not going to help you with it then. You want to do it on your own? Fine. I ain't going to help you with it. That's not what Peter says. God is not neutral towards that type of thinking. He's opposed to it. Like, if you act that way, like this advanced view of yourself, like of control and pride and ego and I'm in charge and I don't want to release anything to anybody, I'm not going to submit to anybody. Peter goes, actually, God opposes that. Like, you've put yourself at odds with God. That's a bad place to be. I visualize that type of person lining up at the line of scrimmage and looking up, and it's God on the other side. Oh, boy. Are you sure you want that? He says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The verb vividly pictures God as one who places himself in battle array against this type of individual. Verse 6, humble yourselves therefore. Circle, underline, highlight the word therefore. Humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Guys, the therefore in this verse is the implication or the application of the fact that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Peter is saying here, if we know this, then we should want that grace. So the key to receiving that grace is humility, choosing to humble ourselves, which in this setting is a type of submission or surrender. No more fighting or chafing against or striving or activity, just letting go and releasing. Peter is writing to believers who are about to suffer persecution. Many of them already are. And Peter is arguing that since God gives grace to the humbled, to the surrendered, to the submitted, since God resists the proud or the assertive or the willful or forthright, believers should therefore humble themselves under God's mighty hand, and they should humble themselves so that God may exalt them. Humility then is not just us presenting ourselves as servants and meek and mild-mannered, but also the manifestation of us handing over our worries to God. Peter says, humble yourselves therefore. The therefore, if God opposes pride, but loves to dole out grace to the humble, then humble yourself. And how do you humble yourself? Verse 7, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. What's so interesting, the word translated here in my version is cast, which is an imperative, it's an action, it's a command. In Greek, it's actually a participle. It's the answer to how you humble yourself. Humbling yourself is the main verb. How do you humble yourself? By casting. It's actually, some of your translations may say that. It's a better translation, I would argue. Casting all of your anxiety onto him. That's how you humble yourself. You don't try to wear it yourself. You don't try to carry it yourself. You don't try to fix it yourself. You choose to cast all your anxiety onto him by humbling yourself. So in the Greek, it's a continuation of the previous sentence. The way we humble ourselves under God's mighty hand is by casting our anxieties onto him. It explains how we humble ourselves under God's control and receive his grace. So the relationship between the main verb from verse 6, humble yourself, and the participle from 7, casting your anxieties onto him, is important because it shows that if we give in to worry, it's actually a form of pride. That's the connection. The logical relationship between the two clauses is as follows. Believers humble themselves by casting their worries onto God. So conversely, if you choose to continue to worry, then you're caving into the sin of pride. Now, how can worry be classified as pride? It's a form of it because when we choose to be filled with anxiety, we're convinced we must solve all the world's problems, especially our own, in our own strength. Or to say it another way, the only God we trust is ourselves. That's what we're communicating. As Francis Chan wrote in Crazy Love, both worry and stress reek of arrogance. They declare our tendency to forget that we've been forgiven, that our lives here are brief, that we're headed to a place where we won't be lonely or afraid or hurt ever again, and that in the context of God's strength, our problems are small indeed. When believers throw their worries upon God, they express their trust in his mighty hand, acknowledging that he is Lord and sovereign over all. As one author writes, affliction either drives us into the arms of God or severs us from God. What Peter is advocating here for, and I love this word casting, the participle there. Notice he doesn't say lay your cares upon him, which is a bit passive, right? The word for casting in the Greek is an energetic word. He doesn't say lay your cares upon him because it takes more energy than that, doesn't it? If you wrestle with anxiety or worry, just laying it down is like a bit, I don't know, it's hard. Because you just pick it right back up. Peter says, cast them onto him, right? Throw it away from you and onto him. The pressures and the burdens of your life are so heavy and difficult, it takes great concentration, great intentionality on our part to throw them onto Jesus. I love what Spurgeon says about this. The work of casting can be so difficult that we need two hands to do it. The hand of prayer and the hand of faith. Prayer tells God what the care is. Prayer asks God to help, while faith believes that God can and will do it. Prayer spreads the letter of trouble and grief before the Lord. Prayer opens the budget sheet, but faith cries, I believe God cares and cares for me. I believe he will bring me out of my distress and make it to promote his glory. Peter says, cast your cares or your anxieties, which is a better translation, cast your anxieties onto him because he cares for you. You see that at the end of the verse, because he cares for you. Which the first century world, they needed reminding of that. The Greek culture didn't have a view of the gods as being beings that cared about them. Or that was so foreign to them. The audience that these folks were saved out of, the gods, if they believed in the gods, some of them at their best might be seen as a bit good, but caring? They don't care. The gods never came to speak to mortals unless it was to tell us to shut up and keep it down because we're making it a racket for them. The gods didn't care about us whatsoever. But what Peter is saying here is that unlike those gods, your God cares about you. Don't forget that. You're used to a worldview or a mind where the gods don't care. Your God cares for you. I mean, look what he did for you. As Paul says in Romans 9, if he who would not spare his only son. See, the story of the Bible is the story of a God who did everything to fix the relationship between us and him. All the activity was on his side. While we were still sinners, before we could even respond, before we were even here, 2,000 years ago, a God loved you so much that he sent his son to pay for the debt we incurred on account of sin. And then that Friday that Jesus died on the cross, he wrote a check that would buy your freedom. And Sunday morning, when God raised him back to life, it was proof that check cleared. We can now have peace with God. He went through all of that for you. That agony that he felt in the garden, he said, my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. That agony, he did that for you. Peter is saying, do you understand how much God loves you? Do you understand how much he cares? A God who would do that, Paul in Romans chapter 9, if he who would not spare his only son, like that's a reckless love that loves you like that. You really think he's got it out for you? You really think he can't be trusted with your stuff? If he would do that, cast your anxieties on him because he cares for you. He's not like those other gods. He cares about you. I mean, just the miracle of that for a minute. There is a being right now who, if he pulled the roof off this place and looked at us, we would die. And he doesn't even have to pull the roof off, but he's in so much glory, speaks the world into creation, and he cares what's going on in your life. That's a miracle. It's shocking, isn't it? I had a professor in seminary who, whenever I read these verses, I think about this poster that was on his wall in his office. And you guys have probably seen something similar from those wildlife shows. And it's just a snapshot of like this cub, this like lion cub retreating under the power and the hand of the lioness. And you can only assume, you can only imagine that the cub is running from something much larger than it. The cub probably poked a bear and then ran, right? And retreated beneath the protection and the power of that parent. That's the image here. That's who God is. His hand of protection over you. Retreat under it. That's what Peter goes on to share. Like, you have an enemy who's chasing you, which is not a popular idea with modern people like us. It feels very primitive to understand a Satan. But Peter goes on to say, make no mistake, you have an enemy who's chasing you. And he knows your triggers. Verse 8, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. You have an enemy who's literally prowling around looking for an opening. He's studying you. He knows your triggers. He knows what makes you worry. He knows what keeps you up at night. He knows what makes you anxious. He's been watching for a long time, and he's really good at it. A couple of years ago, I had a chance to go on safari in Africa. And I remember we were in one of those preserves where you ride around all day. It's like the TV shows, and this giant Jeep, it's got the lid that comes off, right? It's absolutely incredible. And we're riding around with a couple of guides in the front of the Jeep. And every time they see something, they stop the Jeep and they point it out to us, right? And we're riding around and we get to this watering hole where there's this group of impala or deer, antelope, that type of animal. They're just chilling by this watering hole. And what I noticed about them, and I don't have time to chase this too much now, we'll talk more about this next week, but the way that they would stand, these group of deer, right, they stand in such a way that they can watch over each other's shoulders. They can watch each other's back because they don't have a 360 view of the world, right? And they have predators. They know that. So they stand in such a way that they can see, but they've also got someone watching for them to make sure because they know they're vulnerable. So they've got buddies who will watch their blind spots and places of exposure. And it's this beautiful scene where these impala are standing by this watering hole and we're watching this. And as the guide stops, I'm like, oh, we're not here to watch the impala at all. I look over here, and there's this giant lion head in the grass, crouching down on all fours, just watching these animals at the watering hole. And I see him, and I'm like, oh, I don't know what to feel right now. I mean, if something's about to go down, I'm not rooting for it, but I'd kind of like to see it. I don't know what to feel. So I'm just watching him, and I'm watching them, and all of a sudden, the guide turns off the Jeep, which wasn't the response I was expecting. I'm like, shouldn't we keep it running? Like, I mean, something's about to go down. I feel like we should keep it running. And he's like, we're fine. Like, as long as you stay in this Jeep, you're fine. And I'm like, could you turn it back on just for me? Because I feel like we need to be able to go. And he says again, we're fine. If you go outside of this Jeep, you'll die. So stay here and we'll be fine. And so it's like 20 minutes. I'm watching this lion in the tall grass just crouching, not moving. And after about 20 minutes, just watching this thing, watch these other things, I'm like, I don't know what to feel. And then all of a sudden, the Jeep starts up. And I'm like, wait, isn't something about to happen? And he's like, we got to go. But I thought something was about to go down. And I never forget what he goes, maybe. But sometimes they just look because they're planning to attack tomorrow or the next day or the next day. They're always just watching. Wow. Oh, these verses came screaming back to my mind. You have an enemy that stalks his prey. He's lying in cover, just watching you, looking for any sign of weakness. He knows your triggers. He knows what you freak out about. He knows what keeps you up at night. He knows your anxieties. And Peter he's going to write about all the areas of our lives where we need cover. And there's a bit of proactivity that goes into that. We'll talk about that next week. But he wants you to make no mistake. Your enemy knows you and hates you. Why? Not because you're so great, no offense, but because of who your Father is. Anybody knows. You want to get to a parent? Mess with the kids. Your enemy hates you because he hates God. And he would love to take that out on God through you. And as Jesus said, he's come to kill you, to steal you, to destroy you. Oh, Satan doesn't want to mess up your life. Satan wants to devour your life. It's the word Peter uses. He wants to devour you. He's seeking who he can devour. He's come to steal your joy. He's come to steal your happiness. He's come to steal whatever hope you have. He's come to kill whatever future you have. He's come to kill whatever happiness or life or joy that you have. He's coming to destroy the plan God has for your life, which is extraordinary and amazing. And he wants to shut it down because that's his job. And he's really good at it. He's been doing it a long time. And he's been studying people and he's been studying you. And he devours his prey. And it goes slowly, but he knows what's triggering you because he's been watching you. And he's looking to attack you in the places of worry and anxiety because that seems to be a place he can get to all of us. And we live in a culture that says, muster it up, suck it up, push through, do it in your own strength, pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And there is a place for where we can be proactive. We'll talk about next week. But Peter here reminds you who your Father is. Who your Father is. When it comes to your worries and your stresses and your anxieties, pride says that you have to do it on your own. Humility says we can cast it onto him. Cast it onto him. We humble ourselves when we cast our anxieties onto God. God's care comes then when we humble ourselves and depend on his grace. Casting means throwing. In secular Greek, it's the word most often used when men would carry these enormous burdens and cast them onto the back of a camel. You're much stronger than me. You take it. In the New Testament, it's only used in one other place. It's when the people cast their garments over the donkey for Jesus to sit on. We're throwing it away from us, and the target is God himself. You carry it. We're to move from trusting in our own resources to trusting in God's. And the heavier the burden, the better. You can throw that onto him. When I think of the word cast, I think about a fisherman. You cast your line, try to get it far, right? The problem with that word picture is if you're anything like me, you immediately begin to reel it back in. How many times have we cast a burden onto God and then gone, actually, I'm going to need it a little bit longer? I do this all the time. Because I was up early this morning praying about this message. I had intended to go much further in the scripture, and I'm like, I think we just need to stop here. Because this anxiety and worry thing is definitely something that's, I don't know, it's getting to all of us, right? I mean, I just kind of go, when you read something this personal and this imperative, you just kind of go, I think we should just stop and do that. Cast. And so this morning I was trying to cast my anxieties onto God, and probably a dozen times so far today I started reeling them back in and had to cast it again. And so I'm beginning to use a different word picture. You know, the Passion Translation of this verse says, pour out your anxieties and stresses upon him and leave them there, for he always tenderly cares for you. I love that idea of pouring something out physically, like a glass of water, because there's no retrieving it after you've poured it out. Might be a better understanding. Because when I talk to God about the things that concern me, I try to leave them there, but not for very long. I almost instantly think, never mind, I need this a little bit longer. I don't know if I can trust you with it. Let me carry it a ways. The reality is we're not in control. We never were. The enemy will try to trick us into thinking we have control. It's a false sense of it. And he can use that to distract us and to steal our joy and our peace and our rest. When I carry things I'm not meant to carry, they impact me. They impact you physically. They take a toll because what you're carrying is heavy. It weighs you down. You feel anxious and unsettled because you're worried about outcomes that you can't control anyway. And our spirit, our mind, our body are all connected, and so many of us are just showing we've been carrying a burden way too long. We cast it away from us. And as I was thinking about this morning and praying for myself, praying for you, I just felt like God was, I don't know, like this image came into my mind of standing on a cliff and throwing a huge boulder into a lake at the bottom of a waterfall, at the bottom of a cliff. There's no way you'd be able to retrieve that boulder if you threw it away from you. It's a bit different than my way of thinking of casting a line. If you were to hold that boulder for too long, you'd do damage to yourself. But you can throw it and then not pick it back up. So this morning I was like, man, what if we just took a minute to cast our cares upon the Lord? I love this book. I love studying it. I love the what of it. But sometimes I can get lost in the what and forget to pivot to the so what. And I didn't want to do that today. Because some of us, we got some heavy burdens. Some of us are stressed out and worried and anxious. And we think this is just how we're going to live. I guess it's always going to be this way. I had one gentleman tell me today who's a little bit older than me. He's like, I never used to worry as much as I do now. I'm like, oh no, it gets worse. Thanks a lot. But I think that's what Peter, like, when we humble ourselves, we throw it onto God. We reject the pride that says we must carry it. What if the grace that he promises is the grace to leave it? What if that's the miracle? What if that's the exchange? What if that's what we could pray for? God, would you give me the grace to not pick this back up? Would you give me the grace to just live in the freedom and the peace of surrendering this to you? Because he cares about you. He cares. And unlike us, he can actually do something about it. So, could you close your eyes a minute? And maybe, Melissa, if you could lower the lights. I've shared with you, I often wake up very early, especially on Sundays, but most days. It's funny because there's folks who know me and know that I'm up. One of our church elders this morning texted me from Madrid. It was 4:30 our time. The sun was rising there, his time. And he wanted to prove to me he saw it first. And standing here with my eyes closed and just reflecting back to that, it was just such a precious moment. So I tried to visualize myself just releasing, casting my anxieties onto him, throwing them. So in your mind's eye, what if we all just in this moment imagine those things we've been carrying as boulders? And I want to leave a long pause here for you to identify those things. Name them. Get your boulders. Set them down by your feet for a moment before we cast them off. Name them. Think of them. Identify them. In a moment, we're going to sing. close the service with someone praying a prayer over you. If it's your first week with us, at that amen, it's basically how we end. At that amen, you're free to go. We're so thankful that you've worshiped here. Look forward to seeing you next week. If it is your first week, I'll be standing out in the lobby. I'd love to meet you. That's generally how we close. But in the space between here and there, I just wanted to explain what would happen. Just going to pause for a moment. Picture ourselves at the top of a cliff. Those boulders that you've identified and named, they're sitting at your feet. And when you're ready, can you tell God in your own words, in this moment, that you're throwing these away, that you're casting them off and onto Him? No retrieving. Launching them off this cliff. Ask Him for the grace that Peter promises. A grace that comes when we humble ourselves. A grace we'll need to leave those things there, to release them, to not pick them back up. Do this in your own words. Talk to Him. Then when you're ready, start throwing. Holy Spirit, we invite you into this space.